Aloha, welcome to all of you. Um, and I just to make sure, even though I think it's 100% accurate, I just want to make sure that you're all in the right place, organic soil management. Um, so thank you for your attendance, and I hope your participation in this event. Let me very briefly review logistics. There's really only two full speakers doing their presentation, so they're each going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'm going to give you a shorter presentation before that, a little bit of my background and my thoughts, and then mostly the concept is to have more time for questions at the end. So that's really something I encourage. Passed around pieces of paper to write questions on, so you can write down your questions and hopefully, there's not so many of us. We can all participate. So I'll introduce myself. My name's Colehour Bondera, and I want to just mention that with my spouse, we have a small-scale certified organic farm in Honaunau, Hawaii, which is in South Kona, if you know Hawaii at all, on the Big Island. And before we went to this family farm 17 years ago with our little children who are now both in college off island, I grew up on a farm in Oregon, so I have several generations of farming experience. I got distracted in college and worked as a work-study student at NCAP in Eugene, Oregon, when I was at the University of Oregon. I completed graduate studies at UC Davis and then went on to a job at Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania. That's sort of my broad history. I settled on a farm with, like I said, the young children, a very diversified farm. Crops range from coffee to avocados, more fruits than I can list on two hands, tropical greens, table taro, and it really became clear to me at that point in my process, and honestly before that, but it became very clear to me that organic certification was really a difficult reality for the little guy. And so part of my history that's worth mentioning is that I pursued and I served 5 years on the National Organic Standards Board because I realized that the little farmer was being left out of all of the processes. And to go back to my reality as a farmer, which is what I spend my time doing, and I mentioned the diversification of the crops on our farm, which honestly, I'm going to show you this little thing, which you're not going to be able to see, but because I don't have a PowerPoint to show it, but our family created an image. That's the image on our business card. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it shows you simply that what's happening above the ground, which is the plants, is happening equivalently below the ground, the roots. And I think that logo concept shows what I perceive to be the vibrant equality above and below the soil surface. And I think that's extremely important because we have to recognize that the diversity, like I alluded to in terms of what I'm growing above the surface, and some of the crops taro is actually at the surface of the soil level, and we do some root crops, is much more complex and diverse below the surface. And I think that's very critical from my perspective to recognize. And for me, I don't have to think about it or measure it or know, but I don't have to know numbers to be aware that organic matter really, from my perspective, is the vital component of the whole picture in the soil health and in the balance of what's living in the soil. And I will mention, and it doesn't really relate to specifics, but I think some of what Chip presents, I'm certain, and some of what we'll think about, and even, I don't know where you all are from, but I think that recognizing that every situation is different. And Hawaii is a very unique circumstance in that we have extraordinarily young soils, relatively speaking. And that means that the soil particles are extremely large and, again, relatively speaking. And so what's going to hold on to those nutrients and the water in the soil is the organic matter being present in a large, healthy manner. And so that's one of the reasons when I think about it that that's so vital. But I take us back to the comment I made about my own farms and our own decisions, diversity of crops, because I think that you have to recognize, and I don't want to project and think that people necessarily know or can consider what's happening in Hawaii, but I'm growing crops at 5 different levels. So I'm growing trees that are upper level, mid-story, lower level trees. I'm growing things at the ground level, and to go back to what I just said, things like avocados, coffee, which I have about half of my farm is coffee, is actually a mid-story crop, even though we prune it to a lower level one. And but guava is a mid-story crop, for example. And there's plenty of trees, like I have a lot of cacao, and that's a lower story tree crop that grows at about 10 or 15 feet. So between all of those trees, 10 and 15 feet, 30 feet, 80 feet, then I get down to where I have pineapples, and I have, the greens, tropical greens, and even taro, which is a corm, but it's at the soil level, and any of the sweet potatoes or root crops we're growing. So I'm growing at all of those different levels. It's not just diversity in crops at a single level. And I think that that's really important to think about and recognize, because it's also correlates with what those same exact plants are doing to and with the soil. And the only thing I'll mention about that is to think about different root structures, because my image, like I said, you couldn't see, but different trees have different kinds of root structures. And so some trees have a taproot that goes down 20, 30 feet. And many, many, many trees instead are doing lateral root growth. That's how they are functioning. And so the roots are doing different things, and they're accessing and bringing up different nutrients, and then the leaves are coming down or the fruits are coming down and bringing and cycling those nutrients. And I think that whole process in a very diversified system is really an important component of understanding, I'm not going to say the role of the soil, but I think that the fact that the soil is directly related to that whole cycle. It's not an independent, separately operating component. So I think those are sort of broad thoughts that are worth sharing, and that I wanted to give you it's not really an outside perspective, but another perspective of experience, because like I said, and I think we heard a little bit of it yesterday in some references, there's in different ecosystems, you have very different things that you have to pay attention to, whether I think, if it's salt or whatever it is that you're dealing with, that you are going to have to accommodate and reconcile in your circumstance. And I think that that's truly critical to being able to work with the soil health and keep it happy. I think that there's one thing that I wrote down probably yesterday, maybe the day before, but I think it's I think somewhere today it got reiterated for me, and I put it down in my notes for today, and I'd like to mention it, because I think that it's important for me in terms of probably not how I'm here, but maybe, and not exactly why I'm here, but I think for understanding some of these processes, because I think that as a farmer, I don't use quote unquote concrete scientific data to be making my decisions. I'm using experience. And I think that what I wrote down is that advocacy informed by science is very important and makes a lot of sense. But I, as a farmer, am not using data collection that's more than intuition. I'm using experience. And I think that advocacy informed by practice is really critical and important, because that's how in a particular unique situation, you're going to listen to somebody who's advocating something if you know that they have practice right next door and they understand the situation of what you're dealing with. And that's how it's, I think, from my experience, possible to work with small community groups are effective and functional, is because people can and do not just learn from each other, but are able to influence each other in those ways. And in my farming situation, we have 5 or 6 neighbors every single time. I get probably 20 a year. We have apprentices on the farm, and they come and I say, talk to one of those 5 or 6 different neighbors about the same questions, because they're going to have different answers, even though we're 5-acre farms, it's small farms. We're right next to each other, but you're going to get other opinions. And it's not that there's one right or wrong opinion. Instead, it's get the different information from different people, because they have experience too, and it's different than mine. And I think that that's the critical truth, is that there isn't necessarily a right answer. Instead, it's work with the situation and work with what works for you and from your thing. But the only way to get there is really to be having a bunch of different perspectives and learn in the moment, and that is constantly changing. So that said, and I think that my input wasn't as deep as it could have been in terms of focusing on organic soil management per se, but I think that in questions and answers, you can hone me further as you see fit. But I think that with the 2 presenters, and I'll introduce them one at a time as they present, we can take this as far as we have time to take. We were asked to finish a little bit early because we're a little bit behind schedule, but I think we'll be fine. So we're going to have 2 presenters come up here, and Steve Sprinkel is going to be first. And he farms 12 organic acres in Ojai, and works a lot with training farmers and consumer education. I always tell everybody we're all consumers, even if we're farmers and we're doing all these advocacy and everything else, we're still all consumers, but I think it's critical to recognize. With his wife, Olivia Chase, they operate an all-organic grocery, cafe, bakery. I don't know how many of you were here yesterday when he did something, but some presentation, but I think that's a critical component to recognize, that he's bringing together production to people actually going to the farmer and the cook, is what it's called. Been doing that since 2001. And it says here, and I don't think it's wrong, that 15 years as president of Ojai Center for Regenerative Agriculture, pretty significant amount of time. And he's been on the board and the president of Cornucopia. Is also, people who are from California will recognize and know Eco Farm. He's working with Ecological Farming Association in terms of being on that board of directors as well. So I want to welcome Steve to give us his thoughts. Thank you.
I think you can end the slides now. Thank you. You've seen them a number of times now. And I was going to kill him because when Colehour was talking, because I was afraid it would be a distraction. But did you use the word permaculture when you're describing your farm? No, he didn't. He didn't use the word, but that's the big buzz. Permaculture is the big buzz word on this, and what he is describing is a farm that's designed with those stories of trees cascading down to what we call Zone 1, right outside his home, where he can go outside and clip some mint and bring it in for some tea. And if he's really, really hungry, he'll have to go way, way in the back for a breadfruit, right? Something like that. And so I was wondering, do you think that as the trees grow and then they shed their foliage, do you think that nutrition flows downhill slowly to your Zone 1? I should think so. It's good because it's very, very nice. I'm kind of jealous too, because he has permanence in his permaculture with his trees, and tree growing and vines are forbidden in my lease. I'm forbidden. because my landlord doesn't want to rip them out when I leave. Aha. Why would I want to leave? I don't ever want to go, but I'm afraid we're all going to someday. But see, then I'll be a big nuisance to him. Then it'll cost $15,000 an acre to get those trees out of there. They don't want that. So I'm doomed to annual agriculture. I have just a few small prepared ideas before I launch into really practical earth level talk. Henry Wallace was the guy who should have been president of the United States. Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was a man who should have been the president of the United States. He was the vice president of the United States until Franklin Delano Roosevelt's last election during World War II. And prior to that, Henry Wallace was the Secretary of Agriculture during the United States' most significant crisis in agriculture during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. And it wasn't only an environmental crisis, but it was also an economic crisis. And so Henry Wallace is very famous for having been a leader on two fronts, environmentally as well as economically. And one of the things they did in his Department of Agriculture is they planted windrow after windrow, and they gave farmers money to plant permanent windrows, in other words, trees or brush or something to stop the flow of the soil across the prairie. And so that happened during the 30s and 40s. And now with the advent of genetically modified agriculture, we're ripping them all out. We're ripping out all the fences, and everybody's farming 5,000 acres at the get-go. Anyway, the reason why Henry should have been the president is because we probably wouldn't have dropped an atom bomb on the Japanese if Henry had been the president, because he had a heart. And the people who run the world told Roosevelt and the Democratic Party that they shouldn't have Henry Wallace be the president, because they knew that Roosevelt might very well die in his last term. And Henry Wallace, when he was the Secretary of Agriculture, he said that the earth is the mother of us all. Can you imagine a guy in a suit and tie back in Washington, D.C. talking like Krishnamurti or, some guy from, some hipster from the 60s? The earth is the mother of us all. But that's what Henry really believed. His father had believed that when he also was the Secretary of Agriculture. And so that was before the advent of all these chemicals that were delivered to us after World War II. So they tried, in those yearbooks of agriculture, where I got that title, that saying about the mother of us all, in those old 1930s agricultural yearbooks that the USDA used to print, is the blueprint for organic farming as you see it now. Because in those books, they talk about soil, and they talk about crop successions, they talk about nitrogen fixing, they talk about all the various crops that are at one time grown all throughout the United States for various reasons. For instance, flax. Flax is making a comeback now, but it used to be grown quite an awful lot because it was made into linoleum. It was made it into flooring as well as feed. So the earth produced an awful lot of different kind of crops for us back then. Earth. The earth is the planet. The planet's name is Earth. And it's also the dirt. It's also soil, as in the good earth. So earth is also earth. Soil is very, very important to me. As a matter of fact, it's so important to me, I've managed to cut my commerce off to spite my ethics. I was so disappointed with my certifier for their ongoing support of hydroponic agriculture being organic that I renounced my certification in 2016. And I thought I was going to get quickly recertified by Demeter, the Biodynamic Farming Association. They don't certify hydro. Now, hydroponic agriculture is practiced without soil. It could be in a medium, but The one that's headed our way features a very large, beautiful greenhouse with gutters, plastic gutters, hanging from from pipes overhead, with water flowing through them, and strawberries, with their roots immersed in some kind of medium, and the berries, the strawberries are cascading over both sides of the gutter. So as the harvester walks through at waist level, they're now not stooping, they're picking the strawberries and put them into a little shoulder-strapped basket in front of them. And so the ergonomics of this are beautiful. And it's true, in hydroponic, you do save water. And in hydroponic, it's possible that there probably will be eventually fewer opportunities or instances where you might have to use chemicals or organic pesticides to control pests or disease. That's all very, very well possible because it's under a controlled environment. But I thought, this is so fantastic. Why do you need to hook on to organic? You should just call it hydro. If hydro is so darn good, just call it that. And so I thought, well, maybe we should be more moral and ethical about it. So I dumped my certifier. Boy, it has been a real pain in the neck. Because I can't find anybody who doesn't do it. Except for Vermont. And Vermont said, oh, no, we're not going to go. No, we're not. You don't have to go out there, I said. You don't have to come out. Just hire somebody to certify to your standards. So that's what happened to me. That's how important soil is to me. Soil, and now let's get right down to exactly what it is. Soil is at least 95% mineral. Think sand. Think beach. Think mineral. Think soil as being nothing but ground up, very fine rocks. And the deeper you go in the soil strata, the more likely it is that you're going to find more mineral and less organic matter. And the organic farm that Colehour is discussing, and which we strive for, is a farm in which organic matter is a significant component of the top foot of that topsoil. So you're always striving to maintain a large quantity of organic matter, which is not mineral, carbon-based, slowly decomposing material from plant-based constituency. We achieve that through a lot of different ways. One is through growing cover crops. And if you grow a cover crop, which is a crop you grow intentionally that you don't plan on harvesting, you can put down an awful lot of tonnage of organic material, and you might have started with 14 or 15 pounds of seeds. And you just add water, and you're going to get 10 tons of organic matter. That's a pretty good trade-off. And it really beats buying a bunch of compost and bringing it in, which is what I've always done. I've kind of done compost a lot, made a lot of compost, grown a lot of cover crops, but I really like cover cropping because it's so efficient, and if you have the right equipment, so you can mow the cover crop and put it back in the ground for the microbes to dissolve it and to decompose it, it's an awful lot more efficient, and it's an awful lot more your carbon footprint. In other words, your fuel expenses will not be so high. You won't have trucks bringing in compost all the way from Bakersfield. Now that was the problem that I ran into in 2002 with compost. And I don't want you to stop buying compost, but I want you to think about it. Because I think they've cleaned it up, but I'm not sure if they cleaned it up enough. For one thing, the compost you buy in a bag at a nursery is not really the kind of compost that I would make or you could make in your own home. This material is not broken down very well. If you look at it, it's still got an awful lot of fairly large chunks of wood in it, and it's not broken down, it could be a detriment to your soil. So actually, if you really want to use compost, it's better to make it yourself. If you have to buy compost and let's say you're running a golf course, you're trying to use a compost as a preventative for fungal onset in areas near greens and so on, then these composts that you can buy from, for example, New Era Compost Company in Bakersfield will be of service to you. And that is a fully composted, in other words, completely broken down, aerobic, fixed product. Now, I stopped using the compost in 2002 when Luna Fertilizer dumped about 20 tons on my farm. And I sat there looking at that steaming black pile, and I thought, I really don't know what's in there anymore. Now, when I used to make compost, I used to go over and with a dump truck and use a skip loader to load horse manure over at a polo pony operation. And frequently we would pull out syringes and wrappings from them, because these polo ponies are some of the most abused animals that there are. They're in combat. And so I knew that they were using an awful lot of veterinary medicines and both topical as well as antibiotic to protect the horses. So that made us be somewhat wary. We still didn't stop using the stuff, because we were greedy. It was free. But it kind of taught me a little lesson. Then years later, I started looking at that pile of compost from New Era, and that was coming from the great maw of conventional agriculture. It's coming from Bakersfield. It was coming from all the conventional dairies, the chicken houses, the turkey houses. It was filled with ground up consumer waste, the stuff that they pick up in the bins on the side of the yard, full of your branches and everything. They take back, and then they grind it all up, and then they mix it all up with a scarab machine, and it mixes it all up in really long windrow, 600 feet long and 8 feet high and 10 feet wide. It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And that is a good thing. We've been able to take all this junk, we've turned all of this negative, and we've reduced it down into a positive material. But knowing what I knew about the source material, was this something that I wanted to put on my land continually? By 2002, the GMO deal had really reached a certain point of cognition with me and a lot of other people, that we really didn't know what were going to be the effects of genetically modified agriculture. And I knew the manure that had gone into the making of that compost had come entirely from conventional ag. And conventional agriculture is feeding nothing but modified feed, especially if it's soybeans or corn. Before that time, there was just a little bit of alfalfa, but now it's modified as well. So I stopped. And so I had to replace it. And so I remembered that I had used cottonseed meal a long time ago, and I thought, I better, every bean and every nut is a seed, and every seed has a lot of protein in it, because that's what the plants make. In other words, the beans and the peas grab all the nitrogen out of the air, and then they stick it up into the bean when the plant's making the bean itself, and it changes it into protein. So if there was, say you got if you have a bag of soybeans that are 45% protein, the coefficient of that is 15% nitrogen. Does anybody know about fertilizer here? 15% nitrogen is hot. 15% nitrogen is enough to kill your seeds if you use too much of it. 15% nitrogen will go a long way. I used one 40-pound bag of soybean meal, certified organic soybean meal, 40-pound bag, to fertilize a 400 by 300 foot row. Now that's pretty good. That means I've spent about $40 or $50, and I get maybe $600 out of it. Not bad money, you know. But see, I was trying to be selective about my inputs because I was feeding the soil. And so you know the old adage about you are what you eat? Well, actually, that's not entirely true. You are what your plants eat. If your plants are eating a lot of manure, or if your plants are eating a lot of urea or soluble nitrogen, you know, synthetic nitrogen, that's what you're eating. I mean, I'm such a canary in the coal mine now that if I go out to eat and I buy a salad in a regular restaurant, I can taste the nitrate fertilizer in the lettuce. And I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Sometimes it'd be better off if we didn't know that kind of thing. And so what I have been trying to do is I've been trying to figure out ways to feed the soil so that it will feed me. So the more I give to it that is of benefit, for example, in using the certified organic soybean meal, and I buy about $10,000 a year in certified organic soybean meal. But my vendor won't call it fertilizer. Better keep on calling that stuff feed, because you don't want the government to find out that that's fertilizer. It'll have to go for another review, another stamp of approval. So that's like I have that much in chickens. So I have been using principally these botanical fertilizers as my fertilizer. And I've been growing cover crops. And like Colehour said, I don't need to know, although I don't need to know the basic analysis and the constituencies of every kind of material I'm looking for in that soil. Because like a dowser who knows like where the water is, I can look at my collard greens or my broccoli and I said, you're short on phosphorus. He's purple. There's all these books that Henry Wallace wrote that tell you exactly what's going on in terms of deficiencies that you can just see. Boron deficiency, calcium deficiency, nitrogen deficiency, of course, is the most obvious one. Potassium deficiencies are all availably lookable in the plant itself. And so I do have baseline soil tests that I obtain that I use as background. But I know right now, without doing a soil test, I could go out and I could butch up 2 or 3 beds and I could plant some lettuce seed on there and obtain a crop without putting any fertility on there at all. Because that's how much basic fertility I've got. I just know it's in there. And so what I'm trying to create is an optimum system of production that I can believe in and that's entirely safe. I mean, nobody that I have ever met says that they can eat their fertilizer, you know. And I don't know if you really want to eat, you know, that stuff. But you can eat it. But the negative about using soybean meal to such an extent is that all of your broccoli ends up tasting like tofu. Okay. So now in closing, now, you know, that I was just sitting there looking at that pile of compost from New Era, and it's almost, I said, you know, I don't really know what's in that. I don't know what's in that pile. So I used it, and then that was that. And then about 3 years later, the news hit the papers, the ag papers, the organic plant disease. People were spreading compost on beautiful fields and planting seeds, and the seeds were all coming up, and then within 4 or 5 days, all the fields started to die. They were failing to establish a stand. That was because a carryover herbicide from the stuff that had been sprayed on the alfalfa that had been fed to the cows, carried through the composting process, ended up in the compost, then was spread. I mean, all these various processes, you'd think that that herbicide would have been completely dissolved by now. And then many hundreds of acres were applied this compost, and they failed to establish stands of spinach and lettuce because picloram is a broadleaf herbicide that they were using in alfalfa. So this is one of the things that we have to worry about in a dirty world. It's great to obtain products and to believe the nurseries when we go to, but you should think about what you're putting on your ground, and it's good to do more research. I can tell you, if you're willing to spend just a little bit more money, Sacred Cow compost is made from a biodynamic dairy in the Central Valley. And you can get boxes of this soybean meal. Is it Dr. Earth? I saw it the other day in a big nursery. Big bunch of boxes of all of these botanical fertilizers. So I would stay away from the blood meal. I'd stay away from the bone meal, probably. But I would use soybean meal and some of these other materials if you want to use it in your garden and experiment with it. A little bit does go a long way. You'd be surprised. I mean, if you put 40 pounds, what's 3 times? If you put 40 pounds on 1,500 square feet and that was enough to establish a stand of broccoli, that's really not much material. So you can see a box of it would be fine for your home. And if you were using it on a golf course or something like that experimentally, you would find that you wouldn't probably have to use so much because it's not soluble like soluble fertilizers. Once it's in there, the microbes that are chewing up all of the potential fertilizers have stabilized this material, so it's more liable to stay in the soil strata where you need it in terms of comparison to solubles, which are on their way down to the water table. So that's the end.
I don't know. I think that was just the beginning, but okay. Thank you, Steve. I think that was a very good balanced perspective. I when you were talking, I was thinking for a second, well, I want to be able to eat my cover crops. What are you talking about? You said you couldn't eat your fertilizer. But in any case, let's move forward. So we're going to now move on to our next speaker, who is Charles E., who I've never called him Charles E., but Chip Osborne Jr., who we heard from yesterday. He's nationally renowned organic turfgrass expert and professional horticulturalist, like he says, with 45 years of experience in in overall, and it included greenhouse production. He still has that experience. Founder and president of Osborne Organic in Marblehead, Massachusetts, 18 years in creating safe, sustainable, and healthy athletic fields and landscapes around the entire country, including working in Hawaii. And I think one comment that he made yesterday was noteworthy to me, but I think it's pretty critical to recognize, and I think that it's an amazing attitude, which is that he is seeking action or area leaders on the ground in each of the areas that he as he expands his efforts, because he recognizes that it takes somebody, not just some outside advice coming in and giving it or monitoring it from afar, but somebody on the ground doing the day-to-day activities. And I think that is the way to bring the whole circle together. So welcome, Chip. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you cue up my presentation? I think it's down in the bottom right. There we are, right there. Perfect. So what I'm going to do is sort of try to tie this together and focus on the managed landscape. A lot of similarities between ag and managed landscape. And in my opinion, what I've been doing, I'm conventionally trained like a lot of my colleagues. That's what I was taught in the early 1970s and then moved away from that. So past 20 years, I have been all organic, meaning I don't even use organically allowed pesticides as part of a program unless I need to, so they're not built into a program on the front end. But now, unfortunately, organic isn't good enough anymore, because what happens to me all the time is people want to know, all they want to know. I had a meeting here a couple of cities over on Wednesday when I flew in, and all they wanted to know is, give me the organic product list. Tell me what you want me to use. And that's not what it's all about. That fails every time. We know that fails. So, now we have to be thinking, we got to return health to the soil. We need to be regenerative. Some of you may have heard that term. So we have to go to the next level of integrity in these programs and not fall into that product trap swap out. And regenerative agriculture, regenerative land management absolutely begins with the soil. If we try to begin with the product side of it, it is all failure. Like my two colleagues here, I grew in a greenhouse by experience. I didn't have to test soils. I could tell. The plant talks to me and I talk back to the plant, and we all end up in a happy place and make money, hopefully. Now with what I do, it is that experience, but I'm guided by science. I don't move without a soil test. I have to. I'm in different regions of the country. So what I do in New England is not what I would do here in Southern California. We use compost as a top dress in land management because we can't cover crop. But I will never purchase compost without extensive testing. I test it for chemistry, I test it for biology, I test it for oxalic herbicide residues. So we understand all of that going in, and we look at that. So think about a handful of soil. We're going to focus for the next few minutes on the microbial science. A handful of soil is 45% sand, silt, and clay, which is the mineral, 5% organic matter, and the other half of it is air. So a handful of soil is half solid, half air pockets. Those air pockets should surround every particle. That oxygen that's in that air supports the root of the plant we're growing, and it supports the microbial community. So if I don't have that air there, I'm in trouble, because I can't have an aerobic biomass. It goes anaerobic, and I get all the wrong organisms starting to grow. Part of those air pockets should be filled with moisture, and that's what supports the plant, whether it's a grass, whether it's a tree, no matter what it is. Here's a horse pasture here in New Hampshire that gets 1/4 of the nitrogen that any other horse pasture in New England gets, because it's all biologically driven by the soil. And as Steve said, I use exactly the same thing. When we put down, we use soybean. We have right back here, we have one of the leading organic fertilizer producers in the country, who's based back in the East Coast and has come here because we have a growing market here. Company is PJC Organic. They're going to bring that technology here, and it is soy. It's exactly the same thing. And I put down 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet of turf grass, which is that 40-pound bag in a course of a year. That's all we do. You don't need the 4-step program. So what is biology? How do we support it? That's the critical. We need to scientifically identify it, and then we have to support it. So many of you may have heard the term soil food web. It was a term coined a number of years ago to describe the microorganism complex in the soil. These microbes are involved in the creation and maintenance of soil structure, plant growth, plant nutrition, disease resistance, mineral nutrient availability. All of this happens. This is all happening that we don't see. We have soil tests now where we can put this under a microscope and identify what is there. We have things like bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. Our best understanding of the highly managed landscape is simply to mimic a natural ecosystem. Since 1946, we feel that we can intervene with Mother Nature, and we can do better, and we can manipulate, and we can create what we want, and we don't have to pay attention to that. But whether I'm doing a public park, I'll show you pictures, sports fields, no matter what it is, everything I do is mimicking what's happening in nature, and then trying to bring that concept to the highly managed landscape. Jay mentioned this in his introductory remarks: systems-based management. You focus equally on what you can see and what you don't see. And honestly, what you don't see should deserve a bigger portion of your focus. Because if we're fixed on how nice that plant looks, and we're not focused on what it takes to make that happen, we're going to miss the boat every single time. So whatever the plant material, we need to have that focus of the system. The biology, that biological life touches and affects all the other aspects of soils and their function. Direct relationship between the plant and the soil, and the microbe makes that relationship. The soil gives things to the plant, and the plant gives things back to the soil. So think about a fertilizer bag. How many of you have seen bags that say plant food, tree food, rose food, houseplant food? There's absolutely no food for a plant in a bag of fertilizer. Zero. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are raw materials that act as catalysts in physiological processes of the plant. And one of those biggest catalysts, excuse me, is allowing the plant to make its own food through photosynthesis. Chlorophyll in a leaf, energy from the sun, carbon dioxide and moisture, microscopic openings called stomata. CO2 goes right in, reacts with the chlorophyll, produces amino acid, sugar, carbohydrate. That's the plant food. Plant's going to make its own food by itself, but sometimes, like in a grass system, we need to give it a little bit of help, because many plants on the planet will survive with whatever nitrogen in the soil nature has, and other crops, like we've heard, or some of the things I grow, we need to give it a little bit of a boost. The plant returns exudates back down through the root system to feed the microbes. So a lot of that food that's being produced in photosynthesis goes right back down there to bring those microbes right to the root and work as partners with us. They're called exudates. So if we have carbon dioxide up here, we bring it into the leaf of a plant, we stabilize it into a carbohydrate, and a lot of that goes down through the root. 80% of the carbohydrates produced in photosynthesis go into the root. Half of it drives root growth, and the other half is an exudate that feeds microbial life. So now we've sequestered carbon, because we've taken carbon from here, CO2, and we've sequestered it as an energy source down in the soil. It's energy, it drives the fungal and bacterial fraction, and they in turn create a protective shield around the plant. Here's a picture of an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, where you can see that on the right, we have this fungal organism growing right into the root of that plant. 95% of the plants on the planet can accept mycorrhizal colonization. So you see there, though, the main root and then those little root hairs that are out there, and you see something called a depletion zone. That means that that root hair has taken all the nutrient that's in there, and there's nothing left until you go buy a bag of fertilizer and put some more in there. But if you make a one-time inoculation with these mycorrhizal fungi and then feed them and allow them to flourish, that's going to, as you can see in the diagram on the right, is going to mine that soil for nitrogen, phosphorus, moisture, and pull it in way beyond the root zone. Do you know what happens if I would add fertilizer into this situation? The microbes aren't going to work. They're going to get lazy. Why do I need to work? Somebody's doing all the work for me. So that's why we always think of less is more. The days of buying, bag after bag after bag, we need some, absolutely, but there's a fine balance on that, and that's what Steve talked about. We have organisms called the decomposers. The saprophytes are those examples. They break down organic matter. It can be a bacteria, it can be a fungi. They don't leach nutrients. Nutrients are a byproduct of decomposition. These bacteria produce glues that help form aggregates together into good soil structure. Look over on the right there, in 1 gram of non-rhizosphere soil, which means the root zone, look at the number of bacteria and the length of the fungal hyphae, but now look what happens when you get into the root zone. 600 million goes to 10 billion, and meters goes to miles. Because in the root zone, that carbohydrate food is being produced every single day. Then you have the higher level guys. These are the predators. So the bacteria and the fungi are the low trophic level. And they're doing all that work down there. They're breaking down organic matter. They're decomposing things. They're turning that into a nitrogen source, meaning that nitrogen is now in the body of the bacteria. Then these guys come along, the protozoa, and they eat that bacteria. A byproduct of that predatory relationship is the release of nitrogen in the ammonium form. That nitrogen now is immediately available to the plant. There's something in the soil called a cation exchange site, which is a negatively charged site that holds on to nutrients, and one of the things it can hold on to is ammonium nitrogen. And then we have another bacteria that slides in called a nitrifier. And that nitrifier picks up that ammonium and converts it to nitrate. That's 100% water soluble because it's not attracted to those exchange sites, but it's happening at such small amounts, hour by hour, day by day, that it's in a non-leachable form because it's a byproduct of biomass reaction. So that's where we're looking at with this nutrition, is having it all happen within the biomass. That's what the soy does. The soy puts an organic form of nitrogen in there. It's the protein. The grass plant or the tree or the shrub or an ag crop cannot use it in that form. You have to have this biological conversion to get it to the form that the plant can use. Good gas exchange, meaning oxygen, is absolutely critical. If we don't have oxygen in the soil, this whole process won't work, because the aerobic or the oxygen-loving microbes form cysts around themselves and they go dormant. And then the bad guys begin to develop in anaerobic conditions. When the bad guys develop, disease comes in. When the bad guys comes in, a byproduct is alcohol production, and 1 part per million alcohol can solubilize a plant cell wall. So any of you that have followed children or grandchildren through sports know that a soccer goal usually has a big bare spot in there. Not just that the goalie is ripping up that grass, it's because it's so compacted, there's no oxygen, 25 parts per million alcohol underneath that goal mouth, and the next thing you know, all the roots of the grass are dissolved. So then we have to reverse that to have a healthy situation. These organisms can hold on to 15 pounds of nitrogen, 1,000 square feet in a healthy soil in a year, and they can cycle up to 2.5 pounds of nitrogen every 1,000 square feet per month, irregardless of whether we do a fertilizer application or not. That's the end game. That is the goal in all of this. That is rebuilding the soil. That's the regeneration of the soil that is allowing that kind of a process to happen. So when we did some of the first transitions, we were focused on that. We weren't focused on the first year. We were focused on 3, 4, 5 years out. We even know now which plants prefer which balance of organisms, going from conifer trees that are very strong fungal dominant soil to weeds which are very strong bacterial soil. And everything in between has its own desired relationship. So if we're managing grass on an athletic field, we want to be just about equal. So we actually adjust it that way. So chemical intensive management compromises all of this. Synthetic pesticides, chemically created soluble salt-based fertilizers. I'm going to show you some pictures of Pepperdine University, just up the road a bit in Malibu. It's an iconic ficus tree. It was in big trouble. Synthetic deep root feeding with mineral salts, topical application of salt-based fertilizers. Here it is. This is sort of one of the centerpieces of the campus. You can see there that there's trouble happening there. The recommendation was to drill down and put urea in at the root zone and do the topical applications of fertilizer. We stopped all of that, said no more. All we did was put some compost down. All we did, a little bit of compost, tested it first. You can see there, right down here, you can see the new growth coming out of there, all that new growth. So we've pruned out, they had big dead branches that had been removed, and we pushed that new growth. And look at that, that is that trunk, the age of that trunk, and that was all biologically driven, and it was 2 top dresses of compost, 9 months apart, no fertilizer whatsoever. All the compost was tested biologically and nutrient, and now this tree at that age has a whole new life ahead of it, and it's going to replace it. So we're feeding the soil, not the plant. So that is the systems-based approach, focusing on the soil. We look to solve problems. We don't treat symptoms. You have to always remember that synthetics treat symptoms. That was a problem-solving strategy, that synthetics would have made it go the other way. Different situations, different expectations. It could be residential, a campus, institutions, corporate, sports, state and federal government. Jay and I have been working with the National Park Service since 2010, managing 10 or 12 different parks, school districts, municipal park departments. So it can happen in all situations. Here's a municipal playing field, all biologically driven. Case Western Reserve University, this is an aesthetic that they wanted clover in here. Clover is part of this system. Clover met their expectations. This doesn't have to get any fertilizer because the clover, being a legume, fixes atmospheric nitrogen. Golf, this is another National Park Service project where we're managing a pilot project on a golf course. Natural system where we withheld fertilizer altogether. Nothing goes down here. Do you know what goes down on here to feed this soil? And to feed this little bit of grass that's there, molasses, a little bit of humic acid, and a little compost tea. Zero nitrogen. No nitrogen whatsoever, because it's not appropriate to put nitrogen in that area. So we can take 1 tablespoon of molasses and put it in a quart of water, and or actually put it in 1 or 2 tablespoons in a couple of gallons of water and distribute it over 1,000 square feet and feed the bacteria. We could put 2 ounces of a humic acid, spray it over the same 1,000 square feet, and feed the fungal life. So regenerative, natural, organic turf and land management, eliminating synthetics for control, efficient photosynthesis, making that happen, thinking beyond NPK. So now the primary product lines to support this, when we do introduce product, are the foods for the microbes. It's not necessarily the nitrogen for the grass. On that athletic field, yes, we absolutely need nitrogen. We need to put it down 3 or 4 times a year. Low dose, we're not putting it down at a pound per 1,000 the way we would do with, like a Scott's type program, but we're putting it down at low rates continually and making it into 3 or 4 lower dose applications instead of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 big applications. We support the biomass for plant, soil, and environmental health. So that really is all part of it. That's all part of the regenerative aspect of this. This is what's going beyond organic. It's going beyond that product swap out. Absolutely too much grass in the world. Some should be reduced and eliminated. So here you're looking at a guy that manages grass for a living. And I have clients where I don't even tell them. And they say, don't touch I said, we need to get rid of grass. Don't touch it, don't touch it. I went and ripped out 10,000 square feet of a client's lawn and never asked and never told her. We walked on and she said, what's different here out of 80,000 square feet? I said, you have 10,000 less than you had a month ago. She loves it because we redid it with native material that was supportive. So, my message is that as long as we focus on everything that's under the ground and our programs involve some nitrogen to support the plant if it's a plant that nature can't supply on its own. But it is those things like the kelps and the humic acid and the molasses, those things that very specifically nurture the biological life in the soil and continue to make it grow. That's where plant health comes from. That's where soil health comes from. And that allows us in time to manage in a chemical-free framework. Thank you.